of year is a great time to evaluate your estate plan. Between the federal election and potential tax law changes on the horizon, significant uncertainties may impact estate planning through the end of 2025. And here to talk with me about that is Noah Harden. He's the National Wealth Planning Manager at Comerica Wealth Management. Noah, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. Happy to be here.
Oh, happy to have you here. And it will be a pleasure to have you walk us through what people need to know, where to begin.
Yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to it. This is a topic I think that's been on a lot of people's minds over the past handful of years, really ever since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act came into effect in 2017. People have been thinking about this, and as the years have become, closer and closer to 2026, I think people have been focusing on sort of the uncertainty involved and not really understanding what's going to happen. And so I think this is a timely topic, and hopefully people will get a lot out of this.
Yeah, people were certainly worried about whether the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act would sunset or not. Maybe it becomes a little more clear now that the federal election is over. What should people with no previous planning consider, given what's happened in the federal election?
Well, that I think that's a really good question. And based on the election results, I think a lot of this uncertainty around the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which, just to back up one step, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act changed the estate and gift tax exemption amount. Essentially, it doubled it from what it previously was. And since 2017, there's been increases for inflation. And so for 2024, the estate and gift tax exemption amount is up to $13.6 million per person. And so what we're talking about in terms of uncertainty, particularly as it relates to estate planning, is when that provision, that is the increased estate and gift tax exemption, is scheduled to expire at the end of 2025. And so if that were to happen, people will need to rush essentially over the next year and try to implement estate tax planning before they lose that exemption when it gets cut in half in 2026. And so that's kind of sets the stage for some of the uncertainty. And now that we have the election behind us, one really nice thing is I think some of that uncertainty is going to become clearer. And so with Republican power, I think it's aiming towards some of these reductions in estate and gift tax exemption not happening the way we've been worried about over the past few years. If there is a unified government, I think I think most people would say that's pretty certain to happen. We'll keep the high exemption amounts. But in the meantime, we're still a little bit stuck because if it's not a unified government, Democrats will have some influence because there will have to be some negotiation, and likely they will get some input, and Republicans will get more input. So we're moving in that direction, I think. And in the meantime, thinking about people who have not gone through any estate planning in the past, don't have an estate plan created, I think you start with the basics. I think you understand what your personal goals are. I think once your personal and family goals are defined, I think it's a little bit easier to then figure out what that path is to get to those goals. So sometimes I say the goals really act as the finish line. And if you don't really understand where the finish line is, it's really hard to run that race to get there. And so I think that's the starting point for anybody who has not undergone estate planning yet, is try to understand your goals. And once you know your goals, I think then moving on to the next step, which is trying to understand the breadth of the planning you really need to have. And that involves other things like understanding your bigger financial picture. What do your assets look like? What's your net worth? What types of assets are there? And a whole host of other issues that you need to think about to try to understand if you need big tax planning, if you don't need any tax planning, will basic documents be enough for you? That's the process you want to go through to try to understand what you need to do. And from there, you can move forward.
Yeah. So it's a matter of identifying your goals long before you think about what instruments you might need, whether it's grants or irrevocable trusts or whatever the instrument is. That will come second, as long as you've defined your goals.
Yeah, I think that's well said.
Yeah. What about people who have had previous planning experience? What do they need to think about now?
Yeah, well, people with previous planning, I think the important thing, especially heading into the end of this year, going into 2025, the end of an income tax year is really an ideal time to sort of review what you've done, think about what's changed in your life. Has your income changed? Are your assets growing? What do those things look like? And try to decide if your estate planning still reflects your wishes in the way that you want it to. It's also a time that you can look at the other things around you and decide what else has changed. If you have kids, if your kids are growing up and getting married and developing wealth of their own, maybe they're having their own kids and getting divorced. It may change what any other one person wants to do with their own estate plan. And so thinking through what's changed and how that affects your wishes and how you want to reflect those in your estate plan, I think is key for people who have already gone through planning.
Yeah. So when you think about, we still don't know what the estate and gift tax exemption might be. Could be 13.6 adjusted for inflation, or it could be cut to roughly $7 million. You've talked about this notion of planning is easy if you're above the exemption or below the exemption, but it's for the people in the middle where planning becomes a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's sort of, you can probably break this up in a lot of ways, but I kind of think about it as there's a group of people who we know are very, very wealthy, and they're going to be over the estate tax exemption amount, no matter what that level is. So if the estate tax exemption is, call it $14 million, we're talking about people who are well in excess of that. If that were to get reduced, we're talking about people who are above that new and reduced estate tax exemption amount. So that group that's well in excess of that, I think we already know they're more than likely going to be focusing on one or more estate tax mitigation strategies. And usually that involves making gifts to individuals, establishing trusts to transfer assets to, and looking for ways to reduce this potential estate tax liability for them and also later generations. And so that's the first group where we know at least we've got a path that we can follow and find some planning. The other side that's maybe a little bit easier is the opposite of that. The groups we know are below the exemption amount. And so for that group, it may be enough just to have basic estate planning documents that describe where your assets are going, who's going to get them if something were to happen, and so on. That group has, there are other reasons why that group might also implement some more sophisticated planning using different trust structures. And it just depends on what those goals are that they've identified. They may have a business that they want to transfer in a more efficient way, so they might use a trust. They may be focusing on how to transfer assets efficiently depending on who the beneficiaries are. Maybe there's, spendthrift issues for the beneficiaries and so on. So it might not be focused on all tax planning, but there might still be reasons to implement some more sophisticated types of planning structures. And so for that group, I think it's really key that they balance the need for any more sophisticated planning structures with the ability to get a 2 steps up in basis on their assets. And so if you don't have to plan for estate tax and you're a married couple, the deceased spouse can give all of their assets to the surviving spouse, hopefully get a step up in basis on those assets, and then when the surviving spouse dies, get a second step up in basis. So then whoever's inherited all of the family assets, then the basis is up to that value at the second date of death. If then they get sold, there's hopefully a lot less capital gain to recognize.
Yeah.
And so that's
go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Bob. I was just going to move to that sort of middle group, which is, I think, the ones that are a little bit harder to move forward and identify and implement the right planning strategies for. And that's that group that's either a little bit above or a little bit below or right at that estate tax exemption amount. And it's hard because a lot of people in that group have significant assets. However, they don't always have a large enough net worth or enough liquidity to be able to transfer those assets to an irrevocable trust or other individuals without personally feeling the effect of those assets not being in their pocket, able to use them at least in the same way. And so that becomes a little bit more complicated in trying to structure for people. And so I think focusing on those three groups, it's a little easier to then look forward to 2025 and kind of figure out a game plan.
Yeah. So speaking of estate planning strategies that are flexible, there are several that you mentioned in your article in the Comerica guidebook, disclaimer trusts, slats, and spats. Can you give us sort of an overview of what those are and how they might be used?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the first one that you mentioned, disclaimer trusts. Disclaimer trusts are really great in terms of flexibility. And whenever we're trying to figure out what's going to happen with tax laws, I think most people would agree those are going to be ever changing. Even after this election, we'll get one change, but it's not going to be the last change we ever see. So flexibility really is key. And the disclaimer trusts are really nice because especially for a married couple who are sort of in that middle category, not sure if I'm going to have a state tax liability or not. This gives the ability to establish a trust, give the surviving spouse the ability to say, at the time that the first spouse dies, do we need that estate tax planning or not? And so if they do need to plan for estate tax at the time, then the spouse can disclaim those assets, which the language of the trust would then put them into a tax-sheltered separate trust. However, if at the time the first spouse dies, the surviving spouse says, our assets are nowhere near the exemption, this is not something we need to worry about right now, that surviving spouse can keep those assets, the inherited assets, get that step up in basis at that time, and then hopefully then get that second step up in basis with those assets in their own estate whenever that time comes. So very flexible way to kind of to have both sides. There's obviously risks to this type of thing. You need the spouse to be of, sound mind and able to make those decisions at the time. So, these don't come without risk, but it's a really nice, flexible way for that middle group. The second one you mentioned is a spousal lifetime access trust. A lot of people hear these called slats. Establishing a slat is really a flexible option for married couples. And how this works is, the benefit is it allows a person to gift their assets into an irrevocable trust and name their spouse as the primary beneficiary. And so what this does is the spouse that's gifting those assets to the trust, that gift will use up their exemption in times like now when the exemption is at a really high amount. You can use those, but then the surviving spouse as a beneficiary still has access to those assets if it's needed. And so it's really flexible to be able to use those assets if needed, but then if the assets are left in that trust over time, the assets that remain there hopefully will escape estate tax for both of those spouses at the end of the day. The third one that you mentioned and is in the article here is called a SPAT, a special power of appointment trust. And so this is really interesting because it's really just establishing an irrevocable trust. And in the trust language, it will appoint a person with a special power who has the ability to modify distributions and also change beneficiaries. And that's the big flexible part of this. Because if circumstances have changed, either with the person's finances or maybe with the tax laws, and you need more or less estate tax planning, this provides a flexibility for the power holder to adjust to those changing circumstances, change beneficiaries, modify distributions. So if the exemption amount goes down, for example, trust assets can be directed to beneficiaries who may not have a taxable estate or maybe over to other trusts. So it's a really flexible way to approach this situation where we're not exactly sure where the state and gift tax exemption is going to land.
Yeah. So we've talked about the federal election throughout our discussion today. It seems to me as we think about, and here we are in early November, we still don't know who controls the House. And it might seem for anyone who's listening to our video today that it will be important to sort of pay attention to what happens in the next congressional session and pay attention to what laws may be enacted and how estate and gift tax exemptions may be changing or not. Is that fair advice, or what else do you have to? What else can we offer our folks about that?
Well, no, I think you hit it on the head. I mean, more than anything, we just have to pay close attention to what's going to be happening. I think looking at some of the information that Republicans have put out as part of the campaigns that have been happening over the past year or two, even. There is a little foreshadowing of the direction that they would like to go, and I don't think it's a big surprise to anyone. So a lot of these tax provisions that came in as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that are scheduled to expire after 2025. Many of those, the Republican Party would like to make permanent. And so I think the majority of people, that helps them from a personal income tax standpoint. Certainly keeping these estate and gift tax exemptions high helps people be able to shelter and avoid some of that potential tax. So, I think keeping an eye on it is important, but I also think there's a little foreshadowing been going on, and we can probably expect a lot of these provisions to be extended in a unified government.
Yeah. No, I want to thank you for giving us a deep dive into this topic and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with our viewers. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. It's really been a pleasure to be here with you.